In a dim, dusty parlor, Ezra Wilkes sat by the flickering light of a dying fire, his trembling fingers brushing the surface of an antique clock. The ornate timepiece had arrived mysteriously, a gift from no one. When he turned its brass key, a faint whisper echoed through the room, his late wife, Lillian, calling his name. Desperate to hear her voice again, Ezra wound the clock nightly, unaware that with each turn, time itself began to fray, folding past and future into one haunting tapestry. The storm raged over the countryside, its howling winds clawing at the trees and lashing sheets of rain against the roof of Ezra Wilkes's modest home. Inside, the old man sat hunched in his chair, the flickering light of the fire casting long shadows across the parlor walls. His fingers, gnarled with age, rested on the armrests as his gaze wandered toward the corner where the grandfather clock stood. Its hands, forever frozen at 10:16, were a haunting reminder of a time long past, a life that now felt like a distant echo. Since his wife Lillian's passing, the home had transformed into a mausoleum of memories. The rooms echoed with silence, broken only by the creaks of the settling house and the occasional gust of wind battering the shutters. Ezra's days blurred together, small, repetitive tasks that tethered him to a semblance of purpose. He dusted her favorite teacup, arranged her knitting needles just so, and sometimes even hummed the lullabies she used to sing, though his voice often faltered with grief. And at night he would sit in his armchair, staring at the broken clock, half hoping it might one day start ticking again. This night was no different, or so he thought, until a loud knock shattered the quiet. Ezra's heart jolted and he sat up straight, gripping the armrests tightly. The knock came again, more insistent this time, echoing over the sound of the storm. Visitors were rare, almost unheard of given the isolated location of his home atop the hill. Pushing himself to his feet, he grabbed his cane and shuffled toward the door. His joints protested with each step, the wooden floor groaning beneath his weight. By the time he reached the door, the knock sounded once more, sharp and demanding. The porch was empty. Rain poured relentlessly, cascading off the edges of the roof as the wind carried leaves and debris across the steps. Squinting against the darkness, Ezra saw no sign of life. Just as he was about to close the door, his eyes caught something sitting neatly on the doorstep. A package, wrapped in weathered brown paper, tied with twine, and sealed with a blob of black wax, the package seemed untouched by the storm. Frowning, Ezra bent down with difficulty and picked it up, his fingers brushing over the damp twine. Back inside, he set the package on the table beside his armchair, his gaze lingering on it as unease crept into his chest. Who would leave something here, in the middle of a storm? And why? After a moment's hesitation, he fetched his letter opener and carefully cut the twine. The paper fell away to reveal an antique clock. It was a stunning piece, unlike anything Ezra had ever seen. No taller than a foot, the clock's brass gears were visible beneath a glass dome, intricate and polished to a gleaming shine. The pendulum, shaped like an ornate key, swung faintly though no one had touched it. Carved into the base was a single word: Eternum. A slip of paper fluttered to the floor as he turned the clock in his hands. Setting the timepiece down, Ezra leaned over to pick up the note. The words, written in elegant script, made his breath catch. Time can be rewritten, Ezra. The storm seemed to grow louder, the wind howling like a chorus of mournful voices. Ezra stared at the note, his mind racing. Who had sent this, and what did it mean? He placed the clock on the mantel beside the grandfather clock, its brass gleaming in the firelight. Though he told himself it must be a prank, he found the note's cryptic message haunting him. As he lay in bed later, the storm rattling the windows, memories of Lillian flooded his thoughts. Her laughter, her smile, the way she hummed as she read by the fire. The ache of her absence never left him. Sometime after midnight, a sound pulled Ezra from his restless thoughts. Tick, tick, tick. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but it grew louder with each passing moment. Sitting up, Ezra strained to listen. The sound was unmistakable, the steady ticking of a clock. But how? The antique clock had not been wound. Grabbing his cane, he made his way to the parlor, the wooden floor cold beneath his bare feet. The fire had nearly died, leaving the room shrouded in shadows, but the clock on the mantel glowed faintly, its gears turning, its pendulum swinging in perfect rhythm. Stranger still, the long silent grandfather clock was ticking too, its frozen hands moving in perfect unison with the new clock. Ezra approached, his heart hammering in his chest. His trembling hand reached out to touch the glass dome of the antique clock. The moment his fingers brushed it, a voice broke the silence. "Ezra." He froze. The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. His breath hitched. "Lillian," he croaked, his voice trembling. "Ezra." The voice came again, clearer now, filled with sorrow. Tears blurred his vision as he stumbled back, his cane slipping from his grasp. "Lillian, is it really you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. The ticking of the clocks grew louder, a deafening rhythm that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. The room around him wavered, as though reality itself were rippling. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The house was silent. Ezra stood there, his chest heaving, his mind spinning. Both clocks were still, their hands frozen once more, and yet he could still feel the echo of her voice lingering in the air, as real as the storm outside. For the first time in years, hope stirred in his heart, a dangerous, fragile hope, but beneath it, unease whispered. Who had sent the clock? What did it mean that time could be rewritten? And what would it cost him to find out? Ezra Wilkes hadn't slept. He couldn't. The events of the previous night clung to him like a vivid dream he couldn't shake. The storm had passed, leaving the countryside silent, but inside his home, the ticking of the clocks carried on unnaturally. The antique clock and the old grandfather clock moved in perfect unison, their hands creeping forward as if time itself had awakened. At the kitchen table, Ezra stared into his cold tea, his mind swirling with questions. The voice, Lillian's voice, had been real. She had called his name with a tenderness that struck him like a blow. But how? And why? His fingers tightened around the teacup. The note that came with the clock echoed in his mind. Time can be rewritten. It was impossible. Time was unyielding, a force beyond any man's grasp. Yet the clock sat in the parlor, defying logic, whispering of things that shouldn't be. Whoever sent it had known him, known his grief, known Lillian. The thought sent an icy shiver through him. Unable to sit still, Ezra rose from the table, his cane tapping against the wooden floor as he shuffled to the parlor. The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, bathing the two clocks on the mantel in a soft glow. The antique clock's polished brass gleamed as if it were alive. "Lillian," he whispered, his voice trembling. He knew it was absurd to speak aloud, but the yearning in his heart overruled reason. "Are you there?" The clocks ticked on, indifferent. Ezra sighed and lowered himself into his chair, his body sagging with the weight of loneliness. He reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed the glass dome of the antique clock. The moment his fingers touched it, the ticking grew louder. His breath hitched. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on him. The edges of the room blurred as if the world were shifting. Then, faintly, he heard it. "Ezra." The voice was soft, distant, but unmistakable. His heart leapt. "Lillian?" "It's me," the voice replied, growing clearer. It was filled with sorrow, yet carried the warmth he had missed for so long. Tears sprang to his eyes. "How? How is this possible?" "The clock connects us," she said, her voice faltering. "But it's dangerous. You mustn't—" The connection broke abruptly, and the ticking returned to its steady rhythm. Ezra sat back, shaking. The moment had been fleeting, but it was enough to reignite a flicker of hope. Yet her warning rang in his ears. It's dangerous. Dangerous or not, how could he stop? How could he abandon the only chance to hear her voice again? The question haunted him as the day dragged on. He remained in the parlor, unable to move, his thoughts consumed by the clock and its mysterious power. As evening fell and shadows lengthened, Ezra made his decision. He would wind the clock. His hand shook as he retrieved the small brass key hidden at its base. Slowly, he inserted it into the mechanism and began to turn. The gears clicked and whirred, their movements impossibly smooth. The pendulum began to swing faster, its motion hypnotic. The air grew heavy, thick with an energy that made the room feel alive. The ticking grew louder, faster, until it became a deafening roar. The walls around him warped, stretching and twisting as though reality itself were tearing. Ezra clenched the arms of his chair, shutting his eyes against the overwhelming sensation of falling. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the parlor. He stood in a sunlit meadow, vibrant and alive. Flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors impossibly vivid. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of wild flowers and earth. Ezra staggered to his feet, his cane sinking slightly into the soft ground. Ezra. He turned toward the voice, his breath catching in his throat. Lillian stood a few feet away, radiant against the golden light of the meadow. She looked as he remembered her, young, vibrant, her smile warm and full of life. "Lillian," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Is it really you?" "It's me," she said softly, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "Oh, Ezra, I've missed you so much." He took a shaky step toward her, his heart pounding. "I've missed you too." He reached for her, his fingers trembling, but the moment his hand touched hers, the warmth of the meadow began to fade. The vibrant colors dulled, and the golden light dimmed into cold shadows. "No," Ezra cried, clutching at her hand. "Please, don't go." "Ezra, listen to me," Lillian said urgently. "The clock, it's dangerous. You must stop using it. It's breaking." Her voice faded, and the meadow dissolved into darkness. Ezra felt himself falling again, pulled back into the parlor. The room was dark, the fire reduced to embers. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clocks. Ezra sat motionless, trembling. Her words echoed in his mind. "The clock is dangerous. You must stop using it." But how could he? How could he give up the chance to see her again? As the night wore on, Ezra's resolve hardened. He would use the clock again. Whatever the cost, he needed answers. He needed her. What he didn't notice was the faint crack forming in the glass dome of the antique clock, a single fissure that caught the light like a shard of broken time. Ezra Wilkes awoke to the relentless ticking of the clocks. It had become his new reality, an unyielding cadence marking his hours and reminding him of the impossible. The crack in the antique clock's glass dome had grown overnight, branching out like a spider's web. Yet even as the crack spread, the clock ticked perfectly, its gears turning with unnatural precision. He couldn't stop thinking about the meadow, about Lillian's warning. Her voice, pleading, sorrowful, clawed at his resolve, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He needed to see her again. He needed to know why the clock had come into his life and what secrets it held. The day passed in a blur. Ezra barely ate, his thoughts consumed by the clock and the fleeting connection it offered. He paced the parlor, his cane tapping against the floor as he glanced at the mantel every few minutes. The crack in the glass dome glinted mockingly, as if daring him to turn the key again. By evening, his resolve had hardened. He would use the clock again, no matter the cost. Ignoring Lillian's warning was easier than confronting the emptiness that had consumed him since her passing. With trembling hands, Ezra retrieved the brass key and wound the clock. The familiar clicking of the gears filled the room, and the pendulum began to swing faster. The air grew heavy, the walls warping as reality shifted around him. He closed his eyes, bracing for the sensation of falling. When he opened them, he was no longer in the parlor. He stood in his old home, but it was as it had been decades ago, when Lillian was alive. The walls were bright with fresh paint, and her lavender perfume lingered in the air. "Ezra?" He turned toward her voice, his heart leaping. Lillian stood in the doorway, her hair tied back and her smile radiant. She looked exactly as she had the day they first met, full of life and energy. "Lillian," he breathed, tears welling in his eyes. "I can't believe it." She stepped toward him, her expression softening. "Ezra, why are you here? You shouldn't have come." "I had to," he said, his voice trembling. "I couldn't bear to be without you anymore." Her smile faltered and she touched his face. Her fingers were warm, real, but sadness clouded her eyes. "Ezra, you're breaking things. You don't understand what you're doing." "I don't care," he cried. "I need you, Lillian. I need to bring you back." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she withdrew her hand. "The clock. It doesn't belong to you. Every time you wind it, you tear at the fabric of time. If you keep going—" She hesitated, looking away. "What happens if I keep going?" She didn't answer. The world around them began to shift, the walls dissolving into darkness. Ezra reached for her, panic rising. "Lillian, don't leave me." "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising sound of the clock's ticking. "Ezra, you have to let me go." The darkness swallowed her, and Ezra felt himself falling, pulled back into the parlor. He gasped as he landed in his chair. The room was cold, the fire in the hearth reduced to embers. The antique clock sat on the mantel, its crack now wider. Ezra stared at it, her words echoing in his mind. "You're tearing at the fabric of time." But how could he stop? How could he let her go when she was so close, so real? The pain of losing her again was unbearable, and the thought of giving up the clock filled him with dread. Over the next few days, Ezra became consumed by the clock. He wound it again and again, each journey taking him to moments he thought he'd lost forever. He saw Lillian in the garden, tending to her roses. He saw her in the kitchen, laughing as she scolded him for stealing cookies. Each visit was bittersweet, a fleeting glimpse of a life he had once known. But with each use, the cracks in the clock grew, and reality around him began to warp. Time no longer flowed as it should. Days bled into nights without warning, and objects in his home shifted when he wasn't looking. The photograph of Lillian on the mantel disappeared, replaced by an empty frame. Flowers in the vase wilted and bloomed in an endless cycle. Ezra ignored the signs, his obsession blinding him to the consequences. He told himself it didn't matter, that as long as he could see Lillian, everything would be fine. But deep down, he knew he was unraveling something far greater than himself. One evening, as he prepared to wind the clock again, a loud knock echoed through the house. Ezra froze, his hand hovering over the brass key. The knock came again, sharp and insistent. His pulse quickened as he made his way to the door, his cane tapping against the floor. When he opened it, he was met with an unexpected sight. A tall man in a dark coat stood on the porch, his face shadowed by the brim of a wide hat. In his gloved hands he held a small leather-bound book. "Mr. Wilkes," the man said, his voice low and even. "May I come in?" Ezra hesitated, his grip tightening on the door frame. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man stepped forward, his presence imposing. "I'm here about the clock." Ezra's heart skipped a beat. "What do you know about it?" The man's lips curled into a faint, unreadable smile. "More than you do, and if you value what little time you have left, you'll let me explain." The tall man stood silently in the doorway, his presence casting a shadow across the parlor. Ezra gripped the doorframe, his mind racing. The stranger's coat was damp from the night air, but he seemed unbothered by the chill. "Who are you?" Ezra repeated, his voice more forceful. "What do you want with my clock?" The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "My name is Victor Cade," he said. And that clock in your parlor, it's far more dangerous than you realize." Ezra narrowed his eyes. "Dangerous? What are you talking about?" Victor stepped forward, his gloved hands clutching a small leather-bound book. "May I come in? This isn't a conversation to have on the porch." Ezra hesitated, glancing back at the clock on the mantel. Something about Victor unsettled him, but curiosity won out. With a nod, he stepped aside, letting the man enter. Victor walked into the parlor, his movements measured. He glanced at the antique clock, the crack in its glass dome catching the dim light. A frown crossed his face. "How long have you been using it?" Ezra stiffened. "What does it matter? Who sent you?" Victor opened the book, its pages filled with diagrams and faded handwriting. "No one sent me. I've been tracking that clock for years. It's one of the few remaining artifacts of its kind, a relic of a timekeeper's work, and if the crack in its dome is any indication, you've been using it recklessly." The words hit Ezra like a blow. He stepped back, his cane wobbling slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about. I just wanted to see her again." Victor's expression softened, though his eyes remained sharp. "I understand. The clock preys on grief. But you need to stop. Every time you wind that clock, you're not just visiting the past. You're unraveling the fabric of time itself." Ezra shook his head. "You don't understand. She's all I have. That clock. It's the only way I can be with her again." Victor stepped closer. "You think you're bringing her back, but you're not. Those moments, you see, they're echoes, fragments. Every time you reach for them, you're creating fractures, tears in reality that can't be repaired." Ezra's grip on his cane tightened. "I don't care about reality. I care about her. You don't know what it's like to lose someone and have no way to get them back." Victor's jaw clenched. For a moment, a flicker of pain crossed his face. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "I know exactly what it's like. That's why I'm here, to stop you from making the same mistake I did." The room fell silent, the ticking of the clocks filling the air. Ezra stared at Victor, his mind spinning. "If you know so much about the clock," he said finally, "then tell me, what happens if I keep using it?" Victor hesitated, his gaze drifting to the clock. "If you continue, the cracks will grow. Not just in the clock, but in the world around you. Time will unravel, and eventually it will collapse. Everything you know, everything you've ever loved, will cease to exist." Ezra's knees weakened and he sank into his armchair. The weight of Victor's words pressed down on him, suffocating and relentless. "But there has to be a way," he whispered. "A way to fix it. To bring her back for good." Victor closed the book. "There isn't. The clock isn't a tool for resurrection. It's a doorway, a bridge between what was and what is. But it was never meant to be used this way." Ezra's hands trembled as he buried his face in them. The thought of losing Lillian again, of letting her go forever, was unbearable. "Why did it come to me?" he asked. "Why was I chosen?" Victor knelt beside him, his tone soft. "The clock finds those who are vulnerable, those who are grieving. It's not malicious, but it's not kind either. It offers you a chance to see what you've lost, but the cost is always too high." Tears streamed down Ezra's face. "What am I supposed to do?" Victor stood, his expression grim. "You have to stop. Destroy the clock before it destroys everything else." Ezra's head snapped up, anger flaring. "Destroy it? I can't. If I do that, I'll lose her forever." "You already lost her," Victor said firmly. "The clock isn't giving her back to you. It's showing you shadows, echoes of a life that's gone. The longer you hold on to those shadows, the more you risk losing everything else." Ezra's breathing grew shallow. He looked at the clock, its crack seeming to pulse in the dim light. The thought of destroying it filled him with dread, but Victor's words lingered in his mind. Before either man could speak, the room began to shift. The walls rippled, and the ticking of the clocks grew louder, erratic. Ezra clutched the arms of his chair as the air grew thick and oppressive. Victor's eyes widened. "It's already happening. The fractures are spreading." Ezra stared at the clock, his heart pounding. He could feel its pull, the temptation to wind it one last time. But for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. "Mr. Wilkes," Victor said sharply, his voice cutting through the chaos, "you have to make a choice. Now." The room trembled, the cracks in the clock glowing faintly. Ezra's hands shook as he reached for the brass key, his mind torn between his longing for Lillian and the reality of what was at stake. As the world around them began to collapse, Ezra made his decision. The air in the parlor grew heavier, the walls rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Ezra's hand hovered over the brass key, his entire body trembling. Victor stood beside him, his eyes locked on the antique clock which seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. "Don't do it, Mr. Wilkes," Victor urged, his voice sharp but controlled. "If you wind that clock again, it may be the last thing you ever do." Ezra's chest heaved, his breath shallow and uneven. The room felt alive, charged with a strange energy that pressed against his skin. The clock's ticking grew louder, erratic, as if it were alive and waiting for his touch. "I can't let her go," Ezra whispered, his voice breaking. "She's all I have left." Victor stepped closer, his tone hardening. "She's gone, Ezra. What you're clinging to isn't real. They're shadows, fragments. Every time you use that clock, you're tearing the fabric of time apart. Look around you. Can't you see it's already breaking?" Ezra's gaze darted to the walls. The photographs on the mantel flickered, shifting between familiar images and empty frames. The flowers in the vase by the window wilted and bloomed in rapid cycles, as though time were struggling to decide where it belonged. Even the fire in the hearth crackled and died before sparking back to life. "I don't care," Ezra shouted, tears streaming down his face. "I need her, Victor. I need to see her, even if it's just one more time." Victor's expression darkened. "And what about everything else? What about the world outside this house? Do you care if it all collapses just so you can hold on to a memory?" Ezra's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white. The brass key gleamed, almost beckoning him, but Victor's words clawed at the edges of his resolve, planting seeds of doubt. "Do you think she'd want this?" Victor asked softly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do you think Lillian would want you to destroy everything just to see her again? To break the world she loved?" Ezra froze, his trembling hand lowering slightly. The mention of Lillian's name struck a chord deep within him, a place untouched by his grief and desperation. He could almost hear her voice, gentle and soothing, telling him to let go. The room trembled violently, the ticking of the clock now a deafening roar. Victor grabbed Ezra's shoulder, his grip firm. "You have to make a choice, Ezra, now." Ezra's mind raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of pain, love, and fear. He had spent years drowning in his loss, clinging to the hope that the clock offered. But now, faced with the weight of his actions, he saw the truth. The clock wasn't a gift, it was a curse. With a cry of anguish, Ezra turned from the mantel, stepping back as if the clock itself burned him. "I can't," he said hoarsely. "I can't destroy it." Victor's face tightened, but he didn't let go of Ezra's shoulder. "Then I will." Before Ezra could react, Victor reached into his coat and pulled out a small hammer. He moved toward the clock with purpose, his every step filled with grim determination. Ezra's heart pounded as he watched, torn between stopping Victor and letting him end it. "Wait!" Ezra called out, his voice desperate. "What will happen if you destroy it?" Victor glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's better than the alternative." Ezra hesitated, his entire body trembling. The room around them was collapsing. the walls rippling and warping as if reality itself were unraveling. The clock's glow intensified, its cracks spreading further across the glass dome. Victor raised the hammer, his grip tightening around the handle. But before he could bring it down, a voice echoed through the room, soft and filled with sorrow. Ezra. Both men froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Lillian. Ezra's breath caught in his throat, his eyes darting to the clock. The glow around it pulsed, and for a brief moment he saw her reflection in the glass. She looked as she always had, kind, warm, and heartbreakingly real. Lillian, Ezra whispered, stepping closer. His hand reached out toward the clock, ignoring Victor's shout of warning. Lillian, is it really you? Her image flickered, her expression filled with sadness. Ezra, you have to let me go. Please, don't do this. Tears streamed down Ezra's face. I can't. I don't know how. You can, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the chaos. You have to, for both of us. Ezra's hand hovered over the brass key one last time. He could feel the weight of her words, the truth in them. She wasn't asking him to save her. She was asking him to save himself. Victor stepped forward, his voice firm. Ezra, listen to her. End this before it's too late. With a trembling breath, Ezra lowered his hand. He turned to Victor, his face pale but resolute. Do it, he said. Destroy the clock. Victor didn't hesitate. He raised the hammer high and brought it down with all his strength. The impact shattered the glass dome, sending shards flying across the room. The clock emitted a deafening sound, a mix of grinding gears and shattering time, before falling silent. The room stilled, the chaotic energy dissipating. The air felt lighter, the walls solid once more. Ezra fell to his knees, his body trembling as the reality of what he'd done sank in. Victor knelt beside him, his voice gentle. You made the right choice, Ezra. It's over. Ezra looked up at the shattered remains of the clock, his chest tightening. For a moment he thought he saw Lillian's face in the shards, her expression one of peace. Then it was gone, leaving only broken glass and twisted metal. She's really gone? Ezra whispered, his voice hollow. Victor placed a hand on his shoulder. She's at peace now, and so should you be. Ezra nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know if he could ever truly let go, but for the first time in years he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The days following the destruction of the clock were eerily quiet. Ezra Wilkes wandered his home, feeling the absence of the relentless ticking that had ruled his days. The silence was both a relief and a burden, as if the air itself mourned the loss of what had been shattered. Victor Cade stayed for a few days after the event, offering silent companionship and occasional advice. You've been through more than anyone should have to endure, Victor said over tea one morning, but you did the right thing. You saved yourself, and more. Ezra wasn't sure he believed him. What had he saved? The world? It felt too vast, too abstract. Lillian was gone. Her voice no longer called to him from the parlor. Her reflection no longer flickered in the glass of the clock. Even her photograph, once a fixture on the mantel, had disappeared entirely when the clock shattered. By the third day, Victor had left, leaving behind only a note. If you ever need to understand more, find me. Time has a way of revealing what words can't. Beneath the signature was a strange symbol, 2 concentric circles split by a jagged line. Ezra folded the note carefully and placed it in a drawer. He wasn't sure he would ever need to find Victor again. For now, there was only the daunting task of living. The first week was unbearable. The house felt hollow, every shadow a reminder of Lillian. Ezra caught himself setting out 2 plates at mealtime, only to put one back with trembling hands. The empty chair by the fire was a wound that refused to heal. He often sat staring at the mantel, half expecting the clock to reappear, as if it might offer him one last glimpse of her. But it didn't. Slowly, Ezra began to move forward. He cleaned the parlor, sweeping up the shards of glass and metal that remained. Each fragment seemed to carry a memory, a piece of the impossible moments he had stolen. One fragment of the clock's face still bore the frozen hands, stuck forever at 11:57. He stared at it for a long time before placing it in a box with the other remnants and carrying it to the attic. The garden became his sanctuary. Lillian's rose bushes, once wild and overgrown, became his focus. He pruned them with care, his hands steady despite the ache in his heart. The act of nurturing something living helped ground him, and in the vibrant blooms he felt her presence. Weeks turned into months. Ezra began to write, not just about Lillian, but about the clock, the things he had seen, and the lessons he had learned. He documented everything in a leather-bound journal, the ink flowing as though the words had been waiting inside him all along. Writing became a way to release the weight he carried, to transform his grief into something tangible. One evening, as he wrote by the fire, a soft breeze stirred the curtains. He looked up, his eyes drawn to the garden. The roses glowed faintly in the moonlight, their crimson petals vivid against the night. For a moment, he thought he saw her, a figure standing among the flowers, her silhouette unmistakable. "Lillian," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, and when he blinked, it was gone. Ezra sat back, a bittersweet smile on his lips. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or perhaps it was something more. Either way, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Life began to take shape again. Ezra visited the village market, reconnecting with old acquaintances. He even opened a small workshop, teaching children how to repair clocks, a skill he had once thought he'd abandoned forever. Each tick of the gears, each pendulum swing, felt like a small victory against the silence that had once consumed him. Lillian remained with him, not as a shadow or an echo, but as a memory. She was in the roses, in the warmth of the fire, in the gentle cadence of his writing. Her absence was a wound, but it was no longer the abyss it had once been. It was a part of him, something he carried with quiet strength. One day, while tidying his desk, Ezra found Victor's note. He unfolded it, tracing the strange symbol with his finger. A flicker of curiosity stirred in him. There were questions he had left unanswered, about Victor, about the clock, about the nature of time itself. But for now, he was content to leave those mysteries untouched. The present was enough. As he placed the note back in the drawer, the sunlight caught a small shard of glass on the mantel. It was one he must have missed during his cleaning. The shard glinted faintly, almost as if winking at him. He picked it up, holding it to the light. For a brief moment he thought he saw the meadow where he had last seen Lillian, bathed in golden light. He smiled and slipped the shard into his pocket. Some things, he realized, weren't meant to be understood. They were simply meant to be cherished. That evening, as the sun set over the garden, Ezra lit a fire in the hearth and settled into his chair. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. For the first time in a long time, Ezra Wilkes felt ready to move forward, carrying the echoes of the past with him as he embraced the life still waiting ahead.